Welcome back to sleepy Lorekeeper. There were ages when the galaxy breathed quietly, and life grew beneath gentle suns. Before the first weapon was raised, before hatred learned a name, before the darkness found a voice, there were worlds that knew only the slow turning of their seasons, civilizations that rose without fear of extinction, seas that had never tasted ash, skies that had never been scarred by the trails of weapons in flight. The galaxy then was not gentle, but it was whole, unbroken. It stretched across the void like a vast tapestry of warm lights, each one carrying the quiet, patient promise of life. And among those early lights were the old ones. They were not rulers in the way younger species would later understand rulership. They had no thrones, no empires carved by conquest. They shaped life the way an artist shapes clay. They guided evolution not with cruelty, but with a kind of distant, ancient duty. Their hands shaped worlds, and their minds stretched beyond the visible spectrum. They walked through the webway as easily as others walked through a doorway. They understood the warp before it had scars. They understood biology before it learned to suffer. To them, time was slow. To them, life was a thing to be nurtured. To them, the galaxy was peaceful. But peace is never universal. There was one world where the light faltered. A world orbiting a star whose warmth had twisted into poison. A world where life did not grow strong. A world whose children were born dying. The world of the Necrontyr. I remember its surface the way one remembers a fever dream, half-faded yet painfully vivid. Towers of bone-like metal reaching upward as if begging the sky to relent. Dust carried by winds that held the metallic taste of decay. A sun that glowed not golden, but pale and hateful. Its dying breath radiating sickness down upon everything beneath it. The Necrontyr were born beneath that star. Born beneath a light that was not a gift, but a curse. They lived short lives, measured not in decades, but in years. Their skin carried the burn of their star from birth. Their bones weakened long before adulthood. Entire generations rose and crumbled before other species finished a single epoch of their history. Their civilization did not expand with hope. It expanded with desperation. They built towering cities not to reach new heights, but to escape the reach of their own sun. Their homes sank deep into the ground, fleeing a sky that wanted them dead. And yet, for all their pain, the Necrontyr were intelligent, determined. Their achievements were not born from comfort, but defiance. Every invention was a shield against their star. Every stride forward was a stubborn refusal to accept extinction. They looked outward into the galaxy and saw other species thriving under gentle suns. They listened to stories whispered through the void of beings who lived not for years, but centuries. They studied the faint traces of ancient paths, winding through reality itself, and learned the name of those who walked them. The Old Ones, beings who lived in harmony with their stars, beings whose lifespans stretched so far that Necrontyr years were like sparks in a storm. Beings who shaped life, yet never saved theirs. The Necrontyr asked a question that would change all things. Why must we die while they live forever? It was not a cry of jealousy at first. It was not the beginning of hatred. It was simply a question uttered by a dying people who saw, somewhere out among the stars, a race who understood the fabric of life better than any mortal could. If the Old Ones had created so many species, if they had the power to heal, if they walked in dimensions untouched by sickness, then why did they not heal the Necrontyr? This question lingered. In the corridors of their cities, in the halls of their triarch, in the minds of scholars who watched themselves aging too fast, in the hearts of parents who buried children whose lives had barely begun. It was a question that ate at them slowly, patiently, quietly, for centuries. And yet the Old Ones did nothing. They saw the Necrontyr. They knew their pain. They observed their suffering with the distance of an ancient mind. But they did not intervene. Perhaps they believed the Necrontyr would find their own path. Perhaps they feared what might come from granting immortality to a race born of struggle and ambition. Perhaps they simply did not think the question mattered. But to the Necrontyr, it mattered more than anything. It was the seed of their resentment, the first ember of the hatred that would one day consume the stars themselves. The quiet beginning of the long war. Before any weapon was forged, before any fleet set sail, before any pact with beings born inside suns. There was simply a dying race looking up at immortals and asking why they were left to die. In that silence, something ancient shifted. A fracture formed not in stone or metal or even in the warp, but in the soul of a species. A slow, inevitable realization. No one was coming to save them. Not the stars, not their sciences, not their leaders, not the Old Ones. And so the Necrontyr turned inward. Their sorrow sharpened into clarity. Their fear fermented into resolve. Their despair hardened into ambition. The first blow of the long war had not yet fallen. But the wound already existed. A wound carved not into bodies, but into destiny. The galaxy was still peaceful then. Life still grew. The Old Ones still walked through their luminous realms with serene patience. But beneath a dying star, a people who had been ignored for too long clenched their teeth against another wave of pain and whispered the thought that would one day remake the universe. If the Old Ones will not grant us life, we will take it. The first blow of the long war was not a weapon, but a question. A quiet question carried across the gulf between mortal suffering and ancient indifference. A question born in the shadow of a dying star, carried on the breath of a people who had so little breath to spare. It traveled not through the warp or the webway, but through intention, through longing, through the old instinct that life should fight for itself. Why must we die while they live forever? For the Necrontyr, it was not blasphemy, not rebellion, not yet. It was simply the first shape of despair, learning how to speak. The Triarch debated it in the silent chambers of their citadel, walls carved from the bones of mountains that had already surrendered to the star's radiation. Their minds were sharp with ancient logic, but heavy with the weary truth that their people were running out of years. Soon, they would run out of generations. Soon, they would be forgotten. The old ones would remain. The Necrontyr would fade. And so, in their quiet desperation, the Triarch sent emissaries toward the luminous dominions of the Old Ones. Slender ships, fragile by comparison to the masterpieces of living geometry that the Old Ones sailed. They carried ambassadors wrapped in shielding layers so thick that they appeared as shimmering silhouettes, not quite flesh and not quite shadow. The emissaries crossed the void with dignity, though they carried the weight of a dying civilization. They did not bring demands. They brought hope carved thin, carried like a candle through a storm. They sought understanding, a cure, a chance. And the Old Ones listened, but they did not act. Their response was as gentle as it was devastating. They explained that the Necrontyr's affliction was woven into their star, that the mutation and decay in their cells was the natural consequence of living beneath a light that had begun to poison itself. To cure the Necrontyr would be to alter the fundamental nature of their bodies, their world, and perhaps even their fate. And the Old Ones did not believe in rewriting fate. They offered advice, not compassion. They suggested sheltering deeper underground, building stronger shields, learning to endure the unendurable. They did not offer the gift the Necrontyr needed: time. The emissaries returned empty-handed. But emptiness in the hearts of the Necrontyr did not stay empty for long. It filled itself with something heavier, something older than their race, something that had waited for the chance to take root. Resentment. It began as a bruised whisper, then a murmur, then a slow, steady rhythm within the dying cities. Why must we suffer while they thrive? The Old Ones had shaped life across the stars. They had birthed civilizations out of dust and will. They had taught entire species how to control the warp, how to bend reality, how to flourish. But for the Necrontyr, there was only silence. A refusal hidden beneath the veneer of wisdom. From the city spires to the deepest subterranean vaults, grief hardened into anger. Families who had buried children asked why immortals could bear to look away. Scholars who had charted the galaxy asked why the brightest lights refused to share even a fraction of their radiance. The Triarch felt that anger rising like a tide. They tried to calm it at first, to remind the people that the Old Ones were ancient beyond comprehension, and that mortals could not demand the attention of gods. But the Necrontyr no longer believed they were dealing with gods. They believed they were dealing with tyrants of nature. They had no weapons fit for a war across the stars. They had no armies strong enough to threaten those who lived in dimensions untouched by decay. They had no power to resist the biological mastery of the Old Ones. But they had one thing left: a choice. A choice to stop begging for life. A choice to stop waiting for compassion. A choice to turn their grief outward. The Triarch convened for a final time on the question that had haunted their people. Could they afford to remain passive? Could they watch their civilization crumble while beings capable of saving them simply observed? It was not a question of victory. It was a question of dignity. And so the Triarch spoke with one mind. If the Old Ones would not share the secrets of life, then the Necrontyr would take them. Their scientists began forging weapons unlike anything they had ever attempted, crude by comparison to the Old Ones' mastery, but terrible in their own right. The first Gauss flares, the first engines of destructive radiation, machines designed not to heal, but to unmake. The Necrontyr built fleets, fragile shells of metal compared to the living vessels of the Old Ones, but numerous and relentless. Each was built with the understanding that the pilot would not live to see it return. At last, the first ships set out. Not emissaries this time, not diplomats, not scholars. Warriors. The Old Ones greeted them with the same calmness they had shown before. They saw the approach of the Necrontyr and opened their hands instead of raising their shields. They believed the dying race had come once more to plead for understanding. They were wrong. The first strike did not shatter a fortress or pierce a shield. It struck at something more symbolic. A biological sanctum. A garden world. A place where the Old Ones had shaped the DNA of 1,000 species. The Necrontyr attacked it with radiation storms. Particles that tore apart the building blocks of life. Weapons that turned forests into dust and oceans into poison. It was a cruel attack. Imprecise. Desperate. It did almost nothing to slow the Old Ones. It did not weaken their dominion. It did not shake their empire. But it shook the galaxy. Because it proved something none had believed possible. A dying race had found the strength to strike at creators. The Old Ones retaliated as one might swat a fly. Their living ships dissolved the Necrontyr fleets. Their warriors stepped through the webway and erased entire strongholds. Their biological weapons turned cities into ash within hours. The Necrontyr suffered losses beyond imagination. entire dynasties fell. Crawling radiation storms consumed continents. The sky itself seemed to break under the counterattack. In any other age, this would have been the end. A brief, tragic war. A final breath of a species that could not endure. But the Necrontyr did not surrender. Not because they believed they could win, but because surrender meant accepting that the old ones were right, that they were meant to be fragile, meant to suffer, meant to die. Instead, they clung to their hatred, not as a weapon, but as a lifeline. The long war did not begin with hope. It began with understanding. The old ones would never save them. The stars would never save them. The galaxy would never save them. If the Necrontyr wanted to live, they would have to abandon the very idea of being mortal. They would have to become something else. And in the depths beneath their cities, in caverns where light never reached, they began to speak the names of beings who were older even than the old ones. Beings who lived in the hearts of suns. Beings made not of flesh or bone, but of hunger and brilliance. Beings who would answer the Necrontyr not with compassion, but with opportunity. The Catan were listening, and the long war was only taking its first breath. When the star gods arrived, the galaxy learned a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of empty space, which is merely the absence of sound. It was not the silence of tombs, which is the echo of lives once lived. This was the silence that comes when something so immense enters reality that all lesser things simply forget how to speak. Long before they were given names by the Necrontyr, long before they were bound in shapes the mortal mind could comprehend, they were nothing more than hungers drifting in the roiling hearts of newborn stars. Vast entities of coherent flame and thought, too simple to be called minds, yet too focused to be called storms. They fed on fusion itself, on the joy of particles embracing and becoming something more. Their existence was an endless feast of light. They did not care for worlds. They did not notice life. To them, galaxies were nothing but great fires to bask in. It was the Necrontyr who taught them to look closer. As the long war dragged itself across the sky, the Necrontyr paid for every strike against the old ones with oceans of blood. Their fleets crumbled, their warriors aged and died between campaigns. Their leaders watched entire bloodlines vanish within a single generation of conflict. Their civilization, already frayed by disease, tore itself further with each attempt to harm those who could not be harmed for long. A mortal people cannot fight an immortal enemy forever. In their desperation, the Necrontyr turned their gaze from the cool light of distant worlds to the burning hearts of the stars themselves. If there was any hope left, it would not be found in quiet places. It would be found in the most violent furnaces of existence. Their scientists observed patterns within those furnaces, strange concentrations of energy. coherent storms where there should only have been chaos. They learned to see the shapes hidden within the fusion. They learned to glimpse the star gods. The first contact was not made in words, it was made in offerings. Near their home star, the Necrontyr erected great engines, arcs of black metal reaching out into the corona like grasping hands. They built lenses of living crystal that bent not light, but hunger. They focused attention, not energy. It was an act of calling, a summons sent into the consciousness of beings that had never needed to notice anything smaller than a sun. And the star gods answered. They turned inward. They gazed across the impossible distance between stars, not with eyes, but with intent. They saw something they had never focused on before: the flicker of mortal lives. To entities that fed on fusion, the energy of a single living soul was hardly more than a grain of dust. But there were so many grains. A galaxy full of them, each mind burning with emotion, fear, hope, desire. Each one a tiny storm of psychic energy. They had never considered devouring such things. Not because they could not, but because they had never thought to. The Necrontyr showed them how. They invited the first star god closer, drawing its awareness into the fragile shell of a body forged for it. A shape of living metal, resonant with stellar energy, able to walk among ships and cities. For the first time, something born within the heart of a star stepped into the world of matter and distance and form. To the Necrontyr who witnessed it, the sight must have been terrible and beautiful, a being of pure destructive radiance, wrapped in a body whose surface shimmered like molten glass, a towering silhouette that moved with the certainty of gravity. The Necrontyr named it, not as an act of power, but of reverence. They thought they were witnessing divinity. They believed they had found salvation. To the star god, this new state of being was intoxicating. It could feel the fragile structures around it. It could tear metal like cloth. It could taste the faint psychic residue of the beings who approached it. And when it realized that consuming a single soul brought a spike of sensation far more complex than 1,000,000 years of bathing in fusion, its hunger changed. It was no longer satisfied with stars. The Necrontyr offered a bargain. They were dying. Their bodies were broken. Their lives were short. They craved release from the slow torture of their biology. In return for freedom from flesh, they were willing to give the star gods something greater than the light of suns, a galaxy of souls. The bargain was accepted, not out of kindness, not out of pity, simply because for the first time in their long existence, the star gods had discovered a richer flavor of energy. The process that followed was called many things: ascension, transcendence, biotransference. In truth, it was a harvest. Across the realms of the Necrontyr, the great monoliths rose. Not the simple weapons of radiation and metal they had built to strike at the old ones, but machines of transformation keyed to the fabric of consciousness itself. tomb cities were redesigned, not as places of rest, but as factories of conversion. The living were guided into chambers where the air hummed with energies the mortal mind was not made to endure. The star gods watched over the process like patient surgeons. The bodies of the Necrontyr were broken down. Their flesh, already weak, was burned away. Their bones were dissolved into nothingness. Their pain, their memories of sickness, their suffering under the dying star were stripped from them. What remained was the bare pattern of identity, the spark that said, "I am." Some of those sparks were captured and bound into new vessels, bodies of living metal, impervious to the cruelty of their star, immune to age, untroubled by disease. Shells that could endure war for as long as war existed. Others were not so fortunate. Each act of biotransference released energy, the psychic shock of a dying self, the scream of identity unmade. The star gods drank that energy eagerly. Entire populations were poured through the engines of transformation. Worlds dimmed. Cities were emptied of breath. Where once Necrontyr had coughed and bled and aged, now only metal feet walked. The star gods feasted as the Necrontyr were unmade and remade, and with every feast they grew stronger. The Necrontyr had wanted to escape death. They did. Their mortal bodies were gone. Their short lives ended. Their sickness cured. In their place stood something new, the Necrons. The name itself was a shard of their past, cut down, hardened, and made sharp. They were no longer bound to a dying star. They no longer feared age. They no longer needed to breathe or sleep or hope. They had become instruments. The star gods cast their gaze across the galaxy and saw, at last, the old ones clearly, not as distant lights but as threats. The masters of biology, the shapers of life, who might one day find a way to unmake even entities born of stars. The old ones had shaped flesh. The star gods would shape death. The long war, which had until then been a lopsided struggle between a dying race and their absent creators, now turned into something far worse. The Necrons marched at the command of their new gods. They moved in ranks of steel beneath skies torn open by energy storms. Their weapons stripped matter down to its bones, and then stripped the bones as well. Where once Necrontyr warriors had faltered after a few short years of battle, the Necrons did not falter at all. They did not tire, did not hesitate, did not break. They did not truly think. For all the immortality they had gained, they had lost something deeper. Most of them no longer remembered the sound of their own names. Most no longer remembered the feel of breath in their lungs. Most no longer remembered why the war had begun in the first place. They were perfect soldiers, ageless. emotionless, endless. The star gods fed on the suffering left in their wake. Every world that fell added to their feast. Every mind that broke widened their smile. Every ruined civilization was a step closer to a galaxy where nothing remained but stars and the ones who ate them. The Old Ones saw what had been created from the Necrontyr and understood the scale of the threat. They were not facing a mortal enemy anymore. They were facing an alliance between cosmic predators and the discarded shells of a people they had once refused to save. For the Necrons themselves, existence narrowed. They marched when commanded. They stood in darkness when dismissed. Between battles, they hung in crypts of black metal, power cycling low, minds dormant or trapped in slow, looping echoes of what they had once been. Yet not all echoes faded completely. In some of them, buried beneath layers of programming and obedience, fragments of Necrontyr memory persisted. A glimpse of a sky beneath a dying sun. A forgotten sensation of thin hands reaching toward warmth. A half-remembered feeling of anger directed at the Old Ones, not at the galaxy at large. Those fragments were not strong enough to stop the war. They were not loud enough to break the chains of the star gods, but they existed. And as the Necrons burned their way across creation, those tiny remnants of self watched from behind metallic eyes and wondered, in the quiet spaces between commands, whether the price of immortality had been too high. The long war was no longer between the Necrontyr and the Old Ones. It had become a war between gods, between creators of life and devourers of souls, between those who had nurtured the galaxy into being and those who now sought to strip it back down to raw energy. The Necrons were caught in the middle. Their bodies belonged to the star gods. Their history belonged to the Old Ones. Their future belonged to no one. And yet, somewhere in that tragedy, a new question began to form. Not spoken, not written, just felt. If the star gods could be used once to reshape a species, could they be unmade? The answer to that question would come later. For now, the Necrons marched, and the galaxy trembled beneath the shadow of the beings born in stars. The long war had entered its burning phase, and there was still so very far to fall. The long war grew until even time seemed to fracture beneath its weight. I remember the first cracks, not as sounds, but as tremors in the quiet places of the galaxy. Those hidden pockets of calm, where even suffering paused to breathe. The Old Ones had once shaped these sanctuaries with gentleness, weaving life through the stars like gardeners tending a sleeping forest. Now, every tremor felt like a root torn from the soil, every shiver a reminder that nothing they built was truly unbreakable. Our new bodies did not fatigue, but the memory of fatigue still lived somewhere in the echoes of what we had been. I felt it as we marched across continents of glass and oceans boiled to mist. A phantom exhaustion, a ghost of mortality, It clung to us like dust from the worlds we burned. We had become something that no longer knew death, yet carried the memory of dying. The Catan guided us with the cold certainty of predators who had tasted blood for the first time in ages. Their hunger was a pressure behind thought, a constant pull toward creation's beating heart. They feasted on suns and screams alike, and each victory seemed to make them clearer, sharper, more defined against the firmament. They no longer merely shone, they loomed. The old ones tried to answer this rising storm not with cruelty, but with desperation. That was the first sign we were winning. Their webway, once a labyrinth of safe passages untouched by the warp, began to fray. I felt it the same way I felt the tremors in time, subtly, in the corners of perception, as if the universe itself winced. Paths that had been smooth now shimmered with instability. Gateways flickered like dying stars. The old ones pushed deeper into their hidden realms, placing more and more strain upon webs that were never meant to bear the full weight of their empire. They created new children to fight for them. I remember seeing the first of these young races through the eyes of a hunter, not yet realizing how many ages later they would shape the galaxy in ways we could never anticipate. The Eldar, so perfect, so luminous, wielding psychic power with the same ease we once held breath. The Krork, brutal, joyous in their violence, born from war itself. Scaled species from water worlds, flesh-born giants from metal moons, and countless others that flickered briefly like sparks before being snuffed by a war too vast for them to understand. Each race was a living cry for help from creators who had run out of time. But even their brightest children could not mend what fear had done to the warp. Every mind that screamed in terror, every species that burned, poured anguish into the Imperium until it twisted upon itself. The warp roiled. Storms birthed storms. Waves of hatred and despair rose high enough to drown whole star clusters in madness. Even our emotionless bodies could feel the residue, a cold pressure at the edge of awareness, like a distant tide trying to swallow the horizon. The old ones faltered. Their healing arts could not mend a dying webway. Their mastery over biology could not outpace the hunger of the Citan. Their wisdom, once endless, found itself cornered by a rage that had forgotten it was once mortal. We walked through their outer strongholds first. Cities grown from living stone, collapsing into themselves as their creators fled. Gardens the size of continents burned to drifting ash. Crystalline towers that sang when the wind touched them, silenced forever by our tread. No triumph filled us, only the slow, inevitable rhythm of purpose. When the last citadels of the old ones finally cracked beneath the weight of our advance, it was not a moment of despair, not a final, heroic stand. It was surrender in slow motion. A candle slowly drowning in its own melted wax. Their final refuges flickered out. Their voices faded from the echo of the galaxy. And for the first time in uncountable ages, the old ones were no longer shepherds of life. They became ghosts. And we, their once insignificant, mortal coughing children, stood upon the ruins of their age in bodies that could never draw breath again. It was victory, but it felt like standing at the edge of a vast, silent lake, watching the last ripple fade. In the stillness that followed, I realized something chilling. The galaxy had not grown safer. It had merely grown empty. And in that emptiness, the Satan whispered of new hungers. When the last of the old ones faded from the galaxy, the stars did not celebrate. They simply continued to burn, patient and indifferent, as they had when we were frail and coughing beneath hostile skies. Light crossed the void in the same slow arcs as before. Worlds kept turning. The great structures the old ones had raised crashed into oceans or drifted apart in silent ruin, and the universe absorbed their fall without a sound. We stood amid those ruins in bodies that no longer felt the pull of gravity in the same way. We were anchored not by weight, but by purpose that had outlived the reasons that birthed it. The long war was over. The architects of our misery were gone. Yet nothing that moved in the darkness felt like victory. The Satan stretched themselves across our perception, more radiant than ever. Their hunger had been a constant companion throughout the war. But now, with the last of the old ones gone, it was no longer veiled by the chaos of conflict. It was unmistakable, clear as a blade. They shimmered above the gutted strongholds of our former masters, basking in the fading echoes of dying gods. Their presence was heavy, a weight upon the firmament. We had given them an entire civilization to consume, and they had feasted until even their star-born appetites slowed. In that quiet, with no more great prey left to chase, they turned their attention elsewhere. For the first time, I felt their gaze fall fully upon us. We had thought of ourselves as allies, as chosen instruments elevated by cosmic benefactors. That illusion had been easy to maintain, while the old ones still resisted. There was always another battle, another fortress to shatter, another world to scour. As long as the war raged, there had been no need to examine what stood behind the fire in the sky. But war, even one that stretches across epochs, must eventually run out of enemies. When it did, we discovered we were not partners. We were meat that no longer tasted of fear, yet still carried the memory of it in our broken souls. The realization came not as a single revelation, but as a creeping awareness that spread through countless dynasties at once. We felt it in the way the Catan lingered above our mustering fields, no longer directing, merely gazing, as if weighing whether to devour what their own hands had reforged. We sensed it in the way their essence flared not at threats, but at moments of mass suffering, drawing in the last echoes of agony from species already dying. They had helped us win the long war. They had never promised us peace. Our bodies did not age. Our minds did not dim. We could stand in the same spot for 1,000,000 heartbeats and feel only the slow drift of dust. Yet somewhere, in the hollows where our souls once rested, an older reflex stirred, a memory of fear, faint but undeniable. It was not a fear of death any longer, but of purpose being stripped away, of existence reduced to fuel. We had traded mortality for everlasting usefulness. Now we saw the price of being useful to gods who only understood hunger. As more and more of the galaxy fell into stillness, the Satan demanded new works, great engines to draw in stellar winds, arrays to split and redirect cosmic rays, silent factories that turned matter itself into offerings. We obeyed at first out of habit. Obedience had been carved into us during biotransference. Our flesh had been burned away along with hesitation. But the Triarch remembered. In the quiet between orders and compliance, they glimpsed what we had become. We had begun this journey as a dying race, pleading for relief from a curse of brief, painful lives. We had waged a war to topple those who had ignored our suffering. Now we stood victorious, chained to new masters who did not even acknowledge the concept of mercy. The rage that rose then was not the hot fury of flesh. It was colder, deeper, forged in metal minds that could plan in spans of time once reserved for stars. We could no longer die easily, but we could still decide. We could still choose what to oppose, even if our bodies had been stolen from us. Quietly, beneath the notice of our radiant benefactors, the first patterns of betrayal took shape. We began to study the Catan not as deities, but as phenomena. We observed how they fed, how their essence fragmented under certain stresses, how their attention could be divided, stretched thin, distracted by bait placed at the edges of their perception. We charted the resonances between their new forms of living metal and the devices we had crafted for them. In the deep vaults of dynasties that had once specialized in science, new designs were etched into stasis-hardened stone. Arrays tuned not to harness stellar energy, but to fracture it. In the arsenals of warrior kings, weapons were reshaped to strike not at flesh or fortification, but at beings of living light. The decision, once made, echoed through our silent legions like a new law of nature. We would not serve as cattle for the star gods. We would turn upon them as we had turned upon the old ones. Not out of hope for redemption, but out of a final, cold insistence that no master would ever truly own us again. The first blow of this second war did not shake the galaxy as the long war had. There were no wounded empires left to cry out, no web of life to reverberate with the impact. It happened in hidden systems, in carefully prepared arenas where Satan had been lured by offerings of power too rich to ignore. One by one, they descended into traps shaped like reverence. What followed was slaughter of a different kind. Star gods did not bleed as we had once bled. They tore, split, refracted. Their screams were flares of raw energy ripping through every spectrum, burning the very fabric of space around them. The engines we had built seized those flares, broke them, folded them back upon the emitters. Shards fell. Pieces of beings that had once bathed in solar coronas and tasted planetary cores were reduced to fragments, each one still impossibly powerful, but no longer whole. We bound these shards in fields and prisons, locked them away in vaults so deep that even our newly perfected senses struggled to touch them. It was the greatest act of treachery the universe had yet seen. It was also the last true exertion of our collective will before the weight of the ages closed in. With the Satan shattered and chained, the galaxy lay quiet in a way it had never known. The old ones were gone. Their children were scattered, some flourishing, some already slipping toward their own cycles of rise and fall. The webways they built were damaged beyond repair. The warp seethed with the residues of their fear, ensuring that no new age would ever be truly calm. We had won freedom from our tormentors. We had ensured that no god, forged in starfire or in biology, would again rule unchallenged. Yet in that moment of stark clarity, another truth emerged, like a reflection seen only when the waters finally stilled. We no longer had a place in the galaxy we had shaped. We were not alive in any way that harmonized with the worlds that remained. There were no children among us, no elders to pass, no cycles of birth or decay. Time, for us, had become a flat line stretching toward infinity. The races that would come to dominate the next ages would fear us, hate us, or worship us as nightmares from a half-remembered era. There was no path in which we simply lived alongside them. What we had become was incompatible with peace. So the Triarch conceived one final answer. Not forgiveness, not surrender, simply absence. If the galaxy could not hold us without twisting around our presence, then we would recede. Not forever, because forever is not a word that sits comfortably even in metal minds, but long enough for new civilizations to rise, to fight, to falter. Long enough for the echoes of our footsteps to fade from the bones of the worlds we had marched upon. The command spread through every dynasty, every tomb, every silent legion standing under dead stars. We would sleep. On countless worlds, vast complexes were sealed. Tomb cities sank into crust and mantle, folding themselves beneath rock and metal strata. Stasis fields hummed to life, cradling entire armies in unmoving stillness. Protocols were written into the core of our being, instructing us to wait, to endure, to ignore the slow movement of galaxies until the appointed hour. I remember the last moments before my own stasis field closed. The sky above my world was dim, washed with the ashes of a war that had ended an epoch. No voices called, no banners flew. The last of the engines that had shattered gods were already being entombed along with their builders. The fragments of Catan, chained and howling in ways that only instruments could detect, were carried into vaults that would not open for ages. We had entered the long war as victims. We ended it as something else entirely. There was no ceremony, no final vow spoken in the open air, only a thought, shared in perfect machine stillness, moving through a network of minds that had once been mortal. We will wait until the galaxy is ours again. It was not a promise of conquest born from arrogance, but the final instinct of a species that refused to vanish completely. If time could not kill us, it would at least carry us forward, burying us under layers of history, until we seemed like nothing more than myth. The stasis field solidified around my awareness. Sensors dimmed, external signals fell away. The faint churn of the universe receded until all that remained was the thin thread of continuity that defined my existence. Thought slowed, not because it had to, but because there was nothing left for it to grasp. Outside, eons would pass. Stars would be born and die. New empires would rise upon ruins they did not understand. Deep in the dark, a simple realization settled into what was left of my soul. We had won the long war. We had broken our gods, toppled our creators, and claimed the empty throne at the heart of a wounded galaxy. But in doing so, we had lost everything we fought for. We no longer had lives to save, only existences to preserve. We no longer had a curse to escape, only a sentence to endure. And so we slept, not as conquerors basking in triumph, but as relics of a choice that could never be undone, waiting in silent tombs while the galaxy above tried to remember how to live without us. If you're still here, maybe start the next episode, or just let the quiet take you. And if you've already drifted off, that's all right. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars.